Nobody in the executive wing of Sterling Motors knew his name. Not his full name, anyway. To the suits on the 14th floor, he was the head tech guy or the senior floor mechanic, a title that somehow managed to reduce 10 years of irreplaceable expertise into something forgettable, something interchangeable, something that could be crossed off a spreadsheet without ceremony. His actual name was Michael Carter, 38 years old, single father of a 9-year-old girl named Lily, and the man whose hands had kept the largest automotive service operation in the city running without a single catastrophic breakdown for nearly a decade. He drove to work in a truck that was 11 years old, packed a sandwich every morning because lunch downtown cost too much, and had never once asked for a raise he hadn't already earned 3 times over. Every morning he dropped Lily at school on his way in, and every evening he picked her up, and in the hours between he gave everything he had to a company that had never once thought to ask who he was or what he had quietly built there. He kept a photograph of Lily on the corner of his workbench, a small square print in a simple frame, a little girl grinning in a bright yellow raincoat. And it was the first thing he looked at when he arrived, and the last thing he saw when he turned off the lights. On that particular Monday morning, as he walked through the wide rolling doors of the Sterling Motors main service floor, his Navy uniform pressed and his name badge straight, he had no idea that the next 30 minutes would change not just his life, but the life of every person who worked alongside him and the life of a billionaire CEO who thought she understood what it meant to run a company. Michael Carter did not look like a man who carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders. That was part of what made him so remarkable. He was broad-shouldered and unhurried, with grease permanently settled into the creases of his knuckles, despite the most diligent scrubbing, and eyes that had a way of scanning an engine bay with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen every possible problem twice. He'd started at Sterling Motors 18 years ago as an apprentice mechanic, working under the great Raymond Schultz, who had trained him with the patience of a craftsman and the precision of a surgeon. When Raymond retired, Michael didn't campaign for the senior position or angle for the promotion in any visible way. He simply kept doing what he had always done, showing up first, leaving last, solving the problems that made other technicians scratch their heads, and writing things down in a battered notebook so that the next person who encountered the same issue wouldn't have to struggle alone. The promotion came to him like all things that find their rightful owner eventually. He accepted it without a speech, shook his supervisor's hand, and was back under a transmission by noon. That was Michael Carter. Over the years, the floor staff had come to orbit him the way that any group of skilled workers naturally gravitates toward the person whose judgment they trust absolutely. When a 30-year-old Porsche came in with a fault code that the diagnostic computers couldn't parse, they called Michael. When a fleet account threatened to walk over a service dispute, Michael's calm explanation was the thing that turned the client's hostility into renewed confidence. When a newly hired technician made a costly mistake on a luxury vehicle, it was Michael who stayed late to help salvage the repair rather than letting the young man drown in consequences. The veteran mechanics called him the backbone. The newer hires called him the guy who made everything make sense. In the culture of that service floor, his word carried the kind of authority that no org chart could manufacture. And yet, upstairs, he was invisible. Sterling Motors had been founded by the late Harrison Sterling, a self-made industrialist who had built the business over 4 decades with a philosophy as simple as it was ironclad. Respect the people who do the actual work, because those people are the company. Harrison had been known to walk the service floor himself every Friday morning, sleeves rolled up, asking questions, listening to answers, learning the names of new hires within their first week. He had a saying, repeated so often it had become part of the company's informal mythology. A business is only as honest as the hands that build it. He had died of a heart attack 14 months ago, at 71, leaving his company and his only daughter to confront a future he had not fully mapped out. Victoria Sterling was 34 years old when she inherited both the title and the grief that came with it. And from the very first day she sat behind the desk that had been her father's, she was determined to prove that sentiment would not soften her judgment. She had an MBA from Wharton, a reputation for surgical efficiency, and a deep, unexamined belief that modern business was a game of metrics, optimization, and strategic positioning, that human capital was a resource to be managed, rather than a relationship to be cultivated. She had never worked a single day on the service floor. She had never picked up a wrench. She had visited the facility exactly twice, both times as a teenager accompanying her father on his Friday morning walks. And both times, she had found the noise and the grease and the relentless physicality of the work slightly overwhelming. She was not cruel, not exactly. She was simply someone who had never learned what she didn't know. Within 6 weeks of taking the helm, Victoria had restructured the executive team, brought in a consulting firm, whose average associate was 27 years old with a master's degree and no industry experience, and commissioned an operational review designed to identify inefficiencies and reduce labor costs by 15%. The consultants produced a report so full of buzzwords and revenue projections that it read more like a vision board than a business strategy, and Victoria had received it with the satisfaction of someone who had finally gotten confirmation of what she already believed. The company was carrying too much weight in its legacy workforce, and transformation was overdue. One of the most enthusiastic advocates of the new direction was a man named Ethan Marsh, who had been brought in from outside as director of operations 6 months before Harrison's death, had never quite earned the respect of the floor staff, and had been looking for a way to secure his own position under the new regime since the day Victoria arrived. Ethan was handsome, articulate, and extraordinarily skilled at presenting other people's failures as evidence of his own good judgment. He had identified Michael Carter as a problem within his first month on the job, not because Michael had done anything wrong, but because Michael's authority on the floor was entirely organic and therefore invisible to the reporting structures that Ethan tried to manipulate. A man that the workers followed by choice, rather than by title, was a man that Ethan could not easily control, and things Ethan could not control made him nervous in the particular way of people who have built their careers on proximity to power rather than competence. He began building his case slowly, methodically, the way a person places one stone at a time to divert the course of a stream. A delayed delivery here, attributed in his notes to miscommunication from the technical floor leadership. A client satisfaction dip there, mentioned in passing to Victoria during one of their regular briefings, with the careful neutrality of someone who wasn't accusing, merely observing. There were 3 engineers on the operations team: Marcus Webb, Diane Holloway, and old Pete Garza, who had been with Sterling Motors for 22 years, who had tried, at different points, to gently correct the picture that Ethan was painting. Marcus had sent an email to Victoria's office, explaining that the delivery delays were a result of a software integration failure in the parts ordering system, not anything related to Michael or the service floor. The email had been acknowledged with a 2-word reply that made it clear it had not actually been read. Diane had requested a meeting and been told Victoria's schedule was full for the next 3 weeks. Pete Garza had simply cornered Ethan in the hallway one afternoon and told him plainly that what he was doing was going to hurt people who didn't deserve it, and Ethan had smiled with the polished ease of a man who had been told uncomfortable truths by better people than Pete Garza, and had never once changed course because of it. The stage was set. All that was missing was an occasion. The occasion arrived in the form of a missed delivery window on a contract with Hargreave Logistics, one of Sterling Motors' 10 largest fleet accounts, which operated 112 commercial vehicles and had been a client for 9 years. The Hargreave contract had become delayed because of a parts shortage, a global supply chain issue that had affected every major automotive service provider in the country, combined with a scheduling conflict that originated in the operations department's new automated booking system, which had been rolled out over Michael's explicit objection that it hadn't been properly tested before deployment. Ethan had overruled that objection in a meeting, documented his overruling, and then, when the system produced exactly the failures Michael had predicted, quietly removed his own name from the relevant project documentation and inserted Michael's in its place. By the time the Hargreave account manager called to complain, the paper trail or the version of it that Ethan had constructed told a story in which Michael Carter had failed to coordinate with the parts team, had ignored scheduling warnings, and had allowed a 9-year client relationship to be jeopardized through negligence. Victoria received this version of events on a Sunday evening. She read it twice. She called Ethan, who expressed concern, disappointment, and the carefully calibrated kind of reluctance that signals to the listener that the speaker is holding back something even worse out of decency. Victoria thanked him for his candor. By Monday morning, she had made her decision. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock sharp. Before the first shift began work, the entire workforce was required to attend floor staff, administrative personnel, parts department, customer relations. Nearly 200 people filled the main briefing room and the adjacent corridor, standing against the walls, arms folded, cups of coffee cooling in their hands, murmuring in the particular low frequency of workers who sense that something is about to happen and are not sure whether to be afraid. Victoria stood at the front of the room in a charcoal blazer and heels, her expression composed in the way that people compose themselves when they have decided that decisiveness is more important than doubt. Ethan stood slightly to her right, holding a printed report like a priest holding a verdict. Michael was in the third row, having arrived early as he always did, and he stood with his arms loose at his sides, watching the front of the room with the patience of a man who had attended many meetings and understood that most of them resolved themselves eventually. He did not know he was the reason for this one. Ethan delivered his presentation with the smooth efficiency of someone who had rehearsed it in front of a mirror. He spoke about operational standards, client expectations, the Hargreave account, the cost of the lost delivery window, and the accountability that the new leadership expected from every level of the organization. He did not look at Michael directly until the very end. When he clicked to the final slide, a single name on a white background, and stepped back to let Victoria speak. Victoria's voice was clear and carried to the back of the room without effort. She said that Sterling Motors was a company in transition, that high standards required consistent performance, and that failure to meet those standards at the leadership level could not be overlooked in the interest of sentiment or tenure. She said that the evidence presented by the operations review was unambiguous. She said that effective immediately, Michael Carter's employment with Sterling Motors was terminated. The room went very still, not the silence of agreement, the silence of shock, the kind that occurs when something happens that the body understands before the mind catches up. Michael stood up slowly. He was not visibly angry. His face had the particular quality of composure that comes not from coldness but from depth, from a man who had learned long ago that the moments requiring the most dignity were usually the moments when dignity was most under attack. He looked at Victoria with the calm steadiness of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to lose. And he asked, in a voice quiet enough that the people at the back had to lean forward slightly to hear, "Have you looked at the complete file? The full record, not just the summary?" Victoria met his gaze without flinching. She said, "I don't need to." Michael nodded, just once. He reached up to his chest, unclipped his name badge, the small rectangular piece of plastic that said Michael Carter, Senior Technical Director, and set it on the table in front of him with a sound that, in that silence, seemed louder than it had any right to be. He picked up his jacket from the chair. He walked toward the door, and then the world changed. The first person to stand was a man named Roy Simmons, 61 years old, gray-bearded, 24 years at Sterling Motors, and a technician whose diagnostic instincts were second only to Michael's own. Roy stood up from his seat in the second row, reached into his shirt pocket, took out his employee badge, and placed it on the table beside Michael's, without a word. He didn't look at Victoria. He didn't make a speech. He simply stood, set down the badge, and moved toward the door. Then Jerome Mitchell stood 32 years old, the youngest senior technician on the floor, a man Michael had personally mentored through his certification. Jerome set down his badge. Then Angela Reyes, who handled the electrical diagnostics bay, and whose work had been cited in a company newsletter 3 months ago as an example of exceptional service quality. Then David Park, and Sam Kowalski. And then what had been a trickle became a current, became a river. And the room, which had been full of standing workers with their arms folded and their coffees going cold, began to empty in a way that was not chaotic or angry or theatrical, but simply, profoundly, deliberate. 20 people, 30, 40. The badges accumulated on the table in a pile that grew with the quiet inevitability of snowfall. The administrative staff exchanged glances. The parts department supervisors looked at each other and then at the floor. The customer relations team stood motionless, as if anchored to the moment. 60 technicians, the entire service floor, and finally, as Michael had nearly reached the main exit, the door to the briefing room opened and a woman named Sandra Elkins, head of technical operations, 15 years with the company, a person whose organizational skill had been as essential to the floor's functioning as Michael's technical expertise, walked in, set her own badge on the table, and walked out again. The technical department of Sterling Motors was empty by 8:45 in the morning. Victoria stood at the front of the now silent room and looked at the pile of badges on the table. She had anticipated resistance. She had prepared herself for complaints, for union reps, for formal grievance procedures filed through proper channels. She had not prepared herself for this, for the absolute, unanimous, wordless verdict of people who had made their judgment without needing to be asked. She told herself, in those first hours, that it was theater, that it was performative solidarity that would collapse under the weight of lost income and family responsibilities, that by noon she would be fielding calls from mechanics who wanted their jobs back and were willing to demonstrate appropriate contrition. She told herself this with the kind of determined certainty that people use to fill the space where doubt has not yet been given permission to exist. She was wrong on every count, and it would take her longer than it should have to understand how completely. The consequences arrived with the speed and totality of a system failure, because that is exactly what it was. By 10 o'clock that morning, 3 vehicles scheduled for service completion before noon were sitting untouched in their bays, their work orders open and their problems unresolved. By noon, the backlog had grown to 11 vehicles. By the end of the day, it was 27. Sterling Motors had a waiting list of fleet clients who depended on scheduled turnaround times as part of their own operational planning. And that schedule, which had run with the precision of a well-maintained machine because of the people who had walked out that morning, began to come apart at every seam. The replacement staff that Ethan sourced over the following 48 hours, a mix of temporary contractors and recent automotive school graduates, arrived with enthusiasm and insufficient experience, and discovered very quickly that the service floor they had been brought in to operate was not a simple collection of vehicle bays and lift stations. It was a system, a highly specific and deeply integrated system of workflows, documentation protocols, quality checkpoints, and client-specific service histories that had been developed and refined over years. And the architecture of that system existed primarily in the institutional knowledge of the people who had built and maintained it. The paper documentation was there, but paper documentation is like a map. It tells you where things are, not how to navigate terrain you have never walked. Within 72 hours, the phones in the customer relations department had stopped ringing and started screaming. The Hargreave Logistics account manager, who had been briefly appeased by the news of Michael's termination, called back to report that 2 of his fleet vehicles were now 3 days overdue on a service that should have taken 1, and that his drivers were sitting idle at a cost he intended to pass directly back to Sterling Motors. 3 other fleet accounts made similar calls. One of them, Bridgeport Municipal Transit, which operated 42 vehicles under a long-term service contract, sent a formal notice that they were initiating a review of their agreement. The industry newsletter that covered the regional automotive service market published a short item noting that Sterling Motors had experienced significant operational disruption following changes to its technical leadership structure, which in the careful language of trade journalism meant that everyone in the business already knew what had happened and was watching to see how bad it would get. What Victoria did not know, what she could not have known, because no one on her executive team had thought to tell her, and she had never thought to ask, was the full scope of what Michael Carter had actually built during his time at Sterling Motors. It was not simply that he was good at his job. The standard repair and service manuals used across every Sterling Motors facility in the region had been written by Michael, who had spent 2 years of his own time standardizing procedures that had previously existed as a patchwork of individual technician habits and outdated manufacturer documentation. The training curriculum for new hires had been designed by Michael, working with Sandra Elkins, because the onboarding process had been insufficient, and Michael had watched too many promising young mechanics struggle and sometimes leave because they hadn't been given the foundation they needed. The inventory management system that the floor used to track parts consumption, anticipate shortages, and maintain service continuity, the system that kept a $100 million operation from grinding to a halt every time a supplier ran late, had been proposed by Michael in a memo 3 years ago, approved reluctantly by management, implemented by Michael himself over 6 weekends, and had since saved the company an estimated $400,000 annually in parts waste and emergency procurement costs. None of this appeared in Ethan's report. None of it appeared in the operational review commissioned by the consultants, because the consultants had not known what questions to ask and had spoken primarily to people who sat at desks rather than people who stood at workbenches. The architecture of the floor, the thing that made it function, was named Michael Carter, and it had walked out the door at 8:40 in the morning on a Monday. And only now, watching a 200-vehicle service queue transform into a crisis that was measurable in dollars and in client trust, was Victoria beginning to understand what that meant. The company's internal audit department launched a review of the Hargreaves situation 3 days after Michael's termination, prompted not by Victoria's instinct but by a request from the board's audit committee, which had been monitoring the operational disruption with increasing alarm. The auditors were thorough, methodical, and professionally indifferent to the political considerations that had shaped the narrative Ethan had delivered. They pulled the original project files for the new automated booking system. They retrieved the email chains from the parts ordering team. They found the timestamp records for the system failure and cross-referenced them against the meeting minutes in which Michael had formally raised his objections. And then, in a subfolder of a shared drive that had not been cleared of its history, they found what Ethan had not expected anyone to look for: the original draft of the operational review summary, with its edit history intact, which showed that several data points relating to the Hargreave delivery failure had been changed after the fact, and that the changes had been made from a computer registered to Ethan Marsh, and that the original, unedited data told a story diametrically opposite to the one Ethan had presented to Victoria. The auditors also found, while they were there, a pattern of earlier manipulations instances, in which Michael had been credited as responsible for operational problems that the underlying data showed had originated in the operations department itself. They found records of 3 separate contract renewals in the previous 2 years, each of which had been in serious jeopardy, until Michael's direct intervention had salvaged them, and in which Ethan had either minimized Michael's role or omitted it entirely from the post-event documentation. They presented their findings to Victoria on a Thursday morning in a meeting that lasted 45 minutes and felt, to Victoria, considerably longer. She sat in that meeting and listened to the auditors speak in the measured, factual language of their profession, and as they spoke, she felt something happening inside her that she was not accustomed to experiencing, and was not at all sure she knew how to manage. It was not simply the recognition that she had been deceived that she could have handled, because being deceived is something that happens to people and can be externalized. It was the recognition of the degree to which she had allowed herself to be deceived, the specific ways in which her own arrogance and her own assumptions had created the conditions for Ethan's manipulation to succeed. She had not read Marcus Webb's email. She had not taken Diane Holloway's meeting request seriously. She had accepted the consultant's report as confirmation of a conclusion she had already reached, rather than as information requiring scrutiny. She had looked at a man with 10 years of irreplaceable service to her company, and fired him in front of his colleagues, because a report said so, and because she had not thought it necessary to look further. Her father would have been devastated. She understood that with a clarity that was physical, something that moved through her chest like cold water, and she sat in the silence after the auditors finished speaking, and did not try to argue or deflect, because there was nothing to argue and nothing to deflect. She thanked the auditors. She went back to her office. She sat at her father's desk, the desk that had been his for 40 years, with the small chip in the left corner where he had once dropped a socket wrench during a visit from a client he'd wanted to impress, and she made herself look at what she had done. Ethan Marsh was terminated the following morning, escorted from the building with a box of his personal items and a letter from the legal department that would, in due course, become the foundation of a fraud and breach of fiduciary duty case. His departure was witnessed by most of the administrative staff and reported to the former floor workers within hours, through the informal channels that connect people who have spent years working alongside each other. The general response among those former employees was something between grim satisfaction and the specific weariness of people who had already known the truth and had simply been waiting for the institution to catch up. Michael Carter received the news from Sandra Elkins, who called him at the garage, where he had been spending his days since leaving Sterling Motors. He thanked her for telling him, set the phone down on a workbench, and went back to what he had been doing, which was rebuilding a carburetor on a 1973 muscle car belonging to a retired schoolteacher named Frank, who had brought it in 2 days after hearing that Michael was available. The garage was a 12-bay facility in an industrial neighborhood 3 miles from Sterling Motors' main location, owned by a man named Joe Briggs, who had been trying to expand his operation for 2 years and had not yet found the right team. He had the right team now. Sandra had arrived first, on the day after the walkout, with 2 of the senior technicians and a request to use the spare bays until they figured out their next steps. By the end of the week, there were 30 people working out of Joe's facility in a configuration that was half organized and half improvised, and the thing that emerged from that improvisation had the particular energy of a place where people are working because they want to be there rather than because they have to be. Victoria drove to the garage herself. She didn't send an assistant. She didn't call ahead. She simply found the address, got into her car, a car that needed new brake pads, though she hadn't noticed, and drove. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon to find the bay doors open. The sound of work and music and occasional laughter mixing in the way it does in a place where people feel at home. She sat in her car for several minutes before getting out, watching through the windshield as people she recognized moved around the space with the easy confidence of workers who know their environment and trust their tools. She saw Roy Simmons explaining something to a young technician with the patient, unhurried authority that comes from decades of knowing what you're doing. She saw Angela Reyes running a diagnostic with the focused intensity of someone who has already formed her hypothesis and is in the process of confirming it. She saw Michael near the back of the facility, working on a lifted SUV, talking over something with a colleague, his back to the entrance. She got out of the car. A few people saw her and went quiet, and the quiet spread through the garage in waves until Michael, sensing the change, turned around. He looked at her across the length of the garage without expression, not hostile, not cold, simply waiting. The way a person waits for something that was always going to happen eventually. Victoria walked toward him, and halfway across the floor, past the workbenches and the lift stations and the people who had left their jobs because of her decision, she felt something she was not prepared for. She felt how small she was in this space, not physically, but in some more fundamental way, in the way of a person who has made themselves large through authority, and is suddenly standing in a place where authority has no currency and only competence and character count. She stopped in front of Michael and she said, without preamble or preamble's substitute, "I need to talk to you. Please." They sat in the small office at the back of the garage, which had 2 chairs and a desk with a coffee maker that had been there since Joe bought the building. Michael handed her a cup without asking, because he was that kind of man, and sat across from her with his hands folded and his expression open in the careful way of someone willing to hear but not willing to be managed. Victoria set the cup down, and for the first time since the death of her father, she did not compose herself before speaking. She said, "I destroyed something that my father spent his whole life building. I destroyed it in a morning. I listened to the wrong person, and I didn't ask the right questions, and I fired a man who had given this company 10 years of his life in front of every person he worked with. And I did it without reading the file." She stopped. Michael didn't fill the silence. Victoria continued, "I know that an apology is not adequate. I know there isn't a word for what an adequate response to this would even look like. But I am sorry. Not as a formality. As the only honest thing I have to offer you." Michael was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had the quality of something that had been thought about rather than performed. He said, "A company isn't a building, and it isn't a strategy document, and it isn't a quarterly report. It's people. It's what happens between people when they trust each other enough to do hard work together. Your father understood that. He didn't build Sterling Motors with capital. He built it with the decision, made every single day for 40 years, to treat the people who worked for him like they mattered. That's not sentiment. That's the only thing that actually works." He paused. "You can rebuild it, but you can't do it with a consultant's report. You have to do it yourself." Victoria looked at him across the small table and said, "I know. I'm starting to." The moment Sterling Motors' largest remaining fleet client put their contract termination in writing, the crisis became existential. Pinnacle Distribution operated 219 vehicles across 4 counties and had been with Sterling Motors for 12 years, and the letter they sent was 4 paragraphs of precise legal language that translated, in effect, to the end of Sterling Motors as a solvent enterprise if it was allowed to stand. The board of directors convened an emergency session and produced 2 items. a motion to remove Victoria Sterling as CEO, and an acknowledgement, grudging and belated, that the company had no technical capacity to resolve the underlying service failures that had triggered the crisis. The vote on Victoria's removal was postponed by one board member, an old friend of Harrison Sterling's named Gerald Pruitt, who had been on the board for 18 years, and who told the room with the quiet authority of a man who has outlasted many crises that removing the CEO in the middle of an operational emergency was the surest way to transform a recoverable situation into a collapse. He proposed a 2-week window. He said that if the operational crisis was not substantially resolved in that time, the vote could proceed with his own support. The board agreed. Gerald called Victoria and told her she had 2 weeks, and then he said, with the directness of a man who had known her since she was 10 years old, "You know what you need to do." She did. She had known since the Tuesday afternoon in the garage. The question was whether Michael would say yes. She went back to the garage the next morning. She didn't call ahead this time either, because she had learned from the first visit that this was a place where showing up was more meaningful than announcing yourself. Michael was already there. He was always already there. She was beginning to understand, and he listened to her explain the situation with the same focused attention he gave to complex diagnostic problems, completely, without interruption, forming his assessment from the totality of what he was given, rather than from the parts that were easiest to process. When she finished, he was quiet. Then he said, "What do you need?" Victoria told him. The Pinnacle distribution contract, the service backlog, the client relationships that were actively deteriorating, the technical failures that the replacement staff had been unable to resolve, the 2-week window, the board, the company, the thing her father had built, all of it, she laid out without softening or strategic framing. The way you have to lay something out when you are genuinely asking for help rather than managing a negotiation. Michael stood up from his stool and walked to the door of the small office and looked out across the garage floor where his people were working, and she could see him calculating something, not profit or loss, but something in a different currency entirely, something about what was owed and to whom, and what the right thing actually was. He turned back to her and said, "I'll talk to them. I can't make this decision for them, but I'll talk to them." He gathered the former Sterling Motors staff that evening, after the day's work was done, in the open space of the garage, with the bay doors up and the late afternoon light coming in low and gold across the floor. He didn't give a speech. He explained the situation clearly and completely, including the parts that were uncomfortable: the board's position, the timeline, the reality that helping Sterling Motors recover would benefit a company that had fired all of them, and the reality that not helping would allow a company built by Harrison Sterling, who had treated every one of them with genuine decency, to fail in a way that would hurt its remaining workers and the clients who depended on it. He said he was going in, if they'd come with him. He said no one was obligated to agree. He said he wanted to hear from them. What followed was an hour of conversation that was, in its own way, one of the most honest things Victoria had ever witnessed, because she stood at the edge of the group and listened to these people talk to each other about work and loyalty and justice and what it meant to do the right thing when the right thing was complicated, and she understood that she was seeing the thing her father had meant when he said that a business was only as honest as the hands that built it. By the end of the hour, there was agreement, not unanimity. 4 people chose not to go back, and Michael thanked them and asked the group to respect their decision. The others, more than 50 people, would return to Sterling Motors the following morning. The conditions were not yet negotiated, the future was not yet certain, but they would go back because Michael was going, and because some things matter more than being right. What happened over the following 11 days at Sterling Motors was the kind of story that people in the industry would talk about for years, not because it was dramatic in any outward sense, but because it was the demonstration, visible and measurable, of what it means when a group of skilled people who trust each other and believe in what they are doing bring their full capacity to bear on a problem. Michael and his team arrived at the facility before dawn on the first morning and began a systematic triage of the backlog, working through the queue with the efficiency of people who know every vehicle, every system, every client's history, and every corner of the facility they are operating in. The replacement contractors, to their credit, fell in behind the returning team without resentment. working under the direction of people who were patient teachers, even under pressure. Sandra Elkins rebuilt the scheduling system from the ground up in 48 hours, working with coffee and the kind of focused ferocity that comes from understanding exactly what is at stake. Roy Simmons personally called the Pinnacle Distribution account manager, a man he had spoken to dozens of times over 12 years, and in a conversation that lasted an hour, rebuilt enough trust to request a temporary extension on the termination notice, not a withdrawal, just a pause, contingent on demonstrated progress over the next week. The account manager, whose name was Tom Callahan, agreed because he knew Roy and because Roy's word, in Tom Callahan's professional experience, was worth considerably more than most formal contracts. By the end of the first week, the backlog had been reduced by 60%. By the end of the second, it was gone. The Pinnacle Distribution termination notice was withdrawn. Gerald Pruitt reported to the board that the operational crisis had been resolved and that the vote on Victoria's removal was no longer necessary, which the board accepted with the relief of people who had not actually wanted to take the action they had threatened. Ethan Marsh's case was referred to the district attorney's office by Sterling Motors' legal department, with the full cooperation of the audit findings and the documented evidence of data manipulation. The legal process would take time, as legal processes do. But the outcome that mattered in the immediate term was that the record was corrected. Every file, every report, every piece of documentation that bore Michael's name in connection with failures that were not his was updated to reflect what had actually happened. The 3 contract rescues that Ethan had omitted from the record were formally documented and credited. The design and implementation of the inventory management system was formally credited. The training curriculum, the service manuals, the operational standards, all of it was attributed to the person who had created it. Victoria oversaw this process herself, reviewing every correction. And the exercise took 3 days and taught her more about her own company than 3 years of executive briefings had. The company-wide meeting that Sterling Motors held 3 weeks after the crisis resolution was attended by every member of the workforce floor staff, administrative personnel, operations team, the full organizational body of a company that had nearly destroyed itself and had been given, by the people it had wronged, the chance not to. Victoria stood at the front of the room, and she looked out at the faces of the people who had shown her what leadership actually looked like. And she did not compose herself or reach for the language of executive communication, because she had learned that composed language was the wrong instrument for this kind of moment. She said, "I want to start by telling you all something true. This company came within days of ceasing to exist. And the reason it didn't come to that end is not me. It is not our board of directors, and it is not any strategy or report or restructuring initiative. The person who saved this company is someone I fired in front of all of you on a Monday morning without reading the file. His name is Michael Carter, and he is standing in this room." She stopped. The room was completely silent, the specific silence that precedes the acknowledgement of something important. "I want to apologize to him in front of every person here, because the wrong I did to him happened in front of every person here. And I want to tell all of you that the only reason I have the opportunity to make this right is because he is someone who, when asked to choose between justice for himself and the good of people who depended on this company, chose the harder thing. I don't know if I could have done that. I am not sure I deserved it." She looked directly at Michael, who was standing near the middle of the room with the same unhurried steadiness that had characterized every moment she had observed him since she'd walked into that garage. And then, beginning at the front of the room and spreading backward, every person in that room stood up. And the applause that filled the space was not polite, and it was not performative. It was the sound of 200 people releasing something they had been holding since a Monday morning 3 weeks ago, when a man had set his name badge on a table and walked out a door and taken everything that mattered with him. Victoria met with Michael privately the following morning and offered him the position of Chief Technical Officer, a seat in the executive suite, a board-level advisory role, and the formal authority that matched the actual authority he had always carried informally. Michael listened to the full offer and then sat with it for a moment. The way he sat with complex diagnostic findings before making a call. Then he said, "I'll take the role, but I need one thing established before I accept, not as a negotiation, but as a condition." Victoria said, "Name it." Michael said, Every person on the technical floor gets a direct line of communication to leadership, not through layers of management and not in quarterly surveys. Real communication, real responses, and a commitment from the top that the people who actually do the work will be consulted before decisions are made that affect how they do it. Not because it's good for morale, because it's the only way to run a company that actually works. Victoria looked at him and said, "Agreed. In writing, in the employment structure, in the way we operate going forward." Michael nodded. He said, "Then yes." They shook hands, and in the handshake was the acknowledgement of something that had been learned the hard way and would not, Victoria had resolved, ever be forgotten. There is a moment in the late afternoon, on clear days, when the light through the high windows of the service floor falls at an angle that turns the ordinary work of the place, the lifts and the diagnostics and the steady, purposeful movement of skilled people doing what they know how to do, into something almost luminous. Something that looks, to the right observer, like more than its practical function. Victoria would sometimes stand on the mezzanine above the floor and watch that light and watch the work, and think about her father walking these same floors on Friday mornings, rolling up his sleeves, learning the names of the new hires, talking to people who worked with their hands about what they needed to do their jobs better. She thought about the distance she had created between herself and this floor when she arrived. The ways in which she had mistaken disconnection for objectivity and disconnection for efficiency, and the precise, irreversible cost of that mistake measured in the 37 days it had taken to almost lose everything her father had spent 40 years building. She had a framed copy of the corrected performance record on her wall now. Not the consultant's report, not the operational review, but the audit team's corrected document, the one that told the true story, and she looked at it when she needed to remember what it felt like to be wrong in a way that mattered. She had also added something to her weekly routine that she suspected her father would have found deeply satisfying. Every Friday morning, she walked the floor. She had learned the names of the new hires within their first week, because it turned out that was not so difficult once you decided it was worth doing. She had found, to her own genuine surprise, that the work was not as overwhelming as she had found it at 13, that the noise and the grease and the relentless physicality of skilled people doing skilled work was not overwhelming at all, but was in fact the sound of a company being honest about what it actually was. She had started keeping a notebook of her own, not for strategy, not for metrics, but for names, for conversations, for the things she learned on the floor that could not be captured in a presentation deck. It was a small thing. It was also, she had come to understand, exactly the kind of small thing that her father had practiced every day of his professional life, and that she had dismissed, and that had turned out to be everything. A business does not collapse when it loses money. A business collapses when it loses the people who make it work, and the trust of the people who make it work, and the understanding that money is the result of that work, rather than the replacement for it. Harrison Sterling had known this. He had tried to pass it on. His daughter had almost had to destroy the thing he loved before she was able to hear it. Michael Carter had given her the chance to hear it anyway. That, she understood now, was not a small thing. That was everything. A leader can build an empire with capital, and can defend it with strategy, and can expand it with ambition, but only with respect, genuine, daily, demonstrated respect for the people who do the actual work, can a leader hold it together. Because in the end, an empire is not the buildings or the contracts or the brand value or the market share. An empire is the people who choose, every morning, to show up and do the work. And people who are respected make that choice freely. People who are not respected find, eventually, another door. Michael Carter had walked through that other door on a Monday morning, carrying nothing but his dignity and the loyalty of 60 people who had watched him work and had decided that the man was worth more than the job. He had not asked them to follow him. He had not made a speech or issued a challenge or framed his departure as an act of protest. He had simply done what he had always done. Showed up, told the truth, and trusted that the people around him would recognize what mattered. That trust, it turned out, was the most powerful thing in the building, more powerful than the CEO's title, more powerful than the consultant's report, more powerful than the org chart and the restructuring initiative and all the instruments of institutional authority that Victoria Sterling had believed, until she didn't, were the things that made a company run. They were not. The things that made a company run were standing in a garage 3 miles away, fixing cars and teaching each other and laughing, and when they came back, because a man who understood what was right had asked them to, they did not come back as employees. They came back as the company. That was the difference. That had always been the difference. And it would take years, and real work, and the particular humility of a person who has been genuinely wrong about something important and has chosen to be changed by it, rather than defended from it. But Sterling Motors would be rebuilt on that understanding, one Friday morning walk at a time, one name learned and remembered at a time, until the company that stood was one that Harrison Sterling, if he could have seen it, would have recognized as his own.